Welcome once again, dear friends old and new. Today we are heading back to Dartmoor, the place so infused with legend that it whispers on the wind and sighs through the leaves of the trees. Today I will tell you of one of the moor's most evil fellows, and his equally wicked, ghostly, cursed daughter, of Pixies who helped a farmer and a gardener, another ghost, a fellow who got his just deserts, and finally, after many, many requests, the tale of the Hairy Hands. We will begin this Dartmoor episode with two linked tales of a father and a daughter, both equally wicked and to this day still spoken of on Dartmoor, even though their tales hark back to the late 1500s. To start with the history of the father, Sir John Fitz, a wealthy Devon aristocrat, born into a life of plenty and wanting for nothing, and as a result becoming more and more reviled in the district for his drunken and debauched ways. He was a bully, and a merciless ill-tempered man, and a murderer to boot. His exploits were so renowned that they were recorded in a book of the time, the Bloody Book. His father had worked diligently as a lawyer, and as such had accrued great wealth, retiring early to Tavistock, and here he made his home, Fitzford House. This John Fitz had his own strange pisky tale. Along with his wife, you see, he was pixie-led over Dartmoor, lost in the fog, both of them, and lost from the path, wandering who knows where, until they came to a spring of clear Dartmoor water, and on drinking from this the pixie spell was broken, and they safely resumed their travels. You can still find this well to this day, Fies's Well, and he had a little structure built over it so it could be easily found. As well as a legal man, John Fitz was also a diviner of mysteries, a seer, an astrologer. While his wife was giving birth and noting how close the baby was to being born, he cast a chart for his soon-to-be child. It was not good. This child would grow to adulthood but suffer an early and violent death. He begged the midwife to do all she could to delay the birth, just by 1 hour. That was all it would need. No time at all, really, but nature would take its course, as nature always does, and the baby came screaming into the world, strong and hearty. His father's heart must have sunk. There was nothing that he could do. It was a boy, and he would be named John after his father. When young John was only 14 years old, his father passed away, aged 61, and in his father's will it had been stipulated that John must stay with his mother, but even this was not to be. Young John was made a ward by the Queen and was sent to live and be raised as a young man by Sir Arthur George, a friend of her favourite, Walter Raleigh. His teenage years from then were happy ones, well cared for and brought up as a young gentleman of the court, and he was said to be a very comely person, a young man well brought up. At last a bride became his, Bridget, 6th daughter of Sir William Courtenay of Powderham Castle, who was also the Earl of Devon, so a very fine match indeed. In August 1596, a baby girl was born to the young couple and they named her Mary. John also came of age and returned to his home of Fitzford House in Tavistock. But things had changed with John. His attitude in life was so different now, a temper that was now swift and potentially dangerous at literally the slightest thing, taking drinking and revels to extreme, and with it known for being boorish and bullying. It was a summer morning in June 1599 when John Fitz with his friends were in the stannery town of Tavistock nearby his home. They were having dinner, and the wine flowed like water and carried on for hours and hours, through midday, and as this happened, his character became more and more obnoxious. He began to brag about his wealth, as he often did, and also the property around that he owned. He said he owned every foot of land freehold on all his vast estate of Devon, and he owed nobody a thing. Everything was his. Now, one of the friends of his there was Nicholas Slanning, from Bickley. Nicholas was known as a very polite and honourable fellow, and he mentioned casually that this was not actually quite true, because he actually owned a freehold of a little plot of land on John Fitz's estate, and should he wish to, which of course he wouldn't, he could actually charge John Fitz rent for that little parcel of land, but he never would because they were good friends. What matter a small piece of land in Slanning name? At this, John Fitz flew to his feet in a rage, calling Nicholas a liar, and drawing his dagger he made to stab the shocked young man. For himself, Nicholas grabbed for his own larger knife and struck Fitz's blade away. The other men around the table regained their senses from the shock and pulled the two men apart, calming them down with words of reason. Not too long after this, Nicholas and his servant left Tavistock and headed home on horseback to Bickley. They had not travelled very far when they came to a very steep and rocky downhill, and so dismounted to carry on more safely on foot. Nicholas wandered into a field while his servant helped the horses pick their way down the uneven hillside. John Fitz now arrived, galloping closer from behind with 4 more men on horseback at his flanks, and as they drew up close, Nicholas asked why the rush to follow him and catch him up. Fitz shouted that he would have revenge for the insults spoken about him, not owning all of his own land. Fitz commanded his men to draw their swords, and all 5 attacked furiously and without care. Nicholas became a part of the fight, and Fitz's men stepped back and sheathed their swords. And that would have been it. Except one of these dangerous fools cajoled Fitz to fight on, and Nicholas's fate from that moment was sealed. In the bloody book, it tells that Fitz's friend raised a sarcastic tone with Fitz at his pulling back his sword, causing his rage to rise again. Slanning stepped back and his spurs caught in the ground. He fell backwards, and John Fitz murdered him there and then, without a bit of remorse. It is believed that this slaying took place at the gateway of Fitzford House, and this gateway still stands today, close by the statue of Raleigh. John Fitz, caring not one iota that he had murdered a friend, did however fear for his own worthless life. He fled to France, and after another Devon noble family, the Courtenays, begged a pardon from the Queen for him, he returned the same year of the murder to carry on as though nothing had happened. And I would like to say that he had learned a lesson from this drunken murder, but no. This time he was 100 times worse, and he was even given a knighthood by new King James on the death of the old Queen Elizabeth. This new king wanted so badly to quickly acquire the loyalty of as many nobles as possible, and they were easily bought. After his time in France, returning to his home where a wife and child still lived became a constant source of annoyance for John. A way he had been able to conduct himself as he pleased. Here was always an accusing eye and many tears, a young fractious child and the shackles of marriage. In one of his tempers he ordered Bridget to leave and take the child, and she did, of course, because there was nothing left to fight for of the marriage. She fled to her childhood home of Powderham Castle, and this meant John Fitz could do exactly as he pleased, and he damn well did. Tavistock, at the time, was known as a town of little drunkenness, a town of sobriety, straightforward town with magistrates likewise. But now the devil had come to Tavistock, in the form of John Fitz, and he and his friends became the scourge of the town, drinking endlessly, persecuting women who crossed their paths, dragging folk from their beds having charged into the houses, smashing windows, which were expensive handmade things at the time, and fighting themselves and any man who they wished. It was rumoured he had killed another innocent man during this time, although historian and all-round antiquarian genius Sabine Baring-Gould disputes this, finding in the records that the man, a constable, did not die but was close to death by the time they had finished with him. And this violent debauchery went on and on and on for years, much to the despair of all who lived in or near Tavistock. As time drew on, as John Fitz was growing older, guilt began to creep into his heart. He was, after all, a murderer. But to avoid this guilt, his actions grew even worse. His friends, though, began to shun him now and avoid his madness. His manor house was even in disrepair, much to the anger of his wife's father. John Fitz began to exhibit signs of paranoia, probably brought on by years of excessive drinking and knowing the hatred that so many local people had for him now. The children of Nicholas Slanning, adults by this time, took to the courts also to sue for their father's murder. In summer 1605, John Fitz was summoned to court in London to stand accused. Fitz was convinced that Slanning's children, or even his own father-in-law, had plans to grab him and murder him. The trip to court in London increased this paranoia, with each mile closer and closer to the capital. Reaching Kingston upon Thames, a place was found for Fitz and his entourage to sleep for the night. But sleep evaded John Fitz. Each creak and crack of the old inn heightened his fear, and eventually he could no longer bear it. And he rose. He ordered his servant to prepare his horse, and alone he rode off, convinced now that even his own servant had been bribed by his enemies to aid in his abduction. At Twickenham he found the Anchor pub. Being 2 in the morning, all of Twickenham and all of the tavern were sound asleep, but Fitz beat at the door with his fists, shouting for attention. The casement bedroom window opened and the pub landlord, a Daniel Alley, asked what he wanted. Fitz demanded a room to sleep in. Now this was a humble tavern, and Daniel Alley apologised but said his inn was really not fit for people of the gentry. Fitz demanded though, and eventually the publican pulled on some clothes, sent his wife to sleep with their children, and they surrendered their own bed to John Fitz for the night. And what a night! All night long the family heard John Fitz, restless, calling out, accusing unseen visitors of pursuing him, shouting at strange visions that enemies wanted his blood. Morning dawned, and Daniel Alley had plans that day to help a neighbour mow his meadow. Daniel's wife, however, and understandably, was terrified of being left alone with this violent, mad stranger. She begged her husband to stay. Soon Daniel's neighbour arrived to collect his friend, and the 2 men spoke of Daniel having to stay, of the strange, mad guest, and of his wife's absolute fear. John Fitz, now on hearing men's voices downstairs, convinced himself this is the time of betrayal, and that those who were hunting him were now at the door. Still dressed in his nightgown, he flew downstairs, and with sword drawn attacked Daniel Alley and killed him there and then. He then ran to attack Daniel's wife, wounding her gravely. As the early morning light now filled the room, John Fitz saw the reality of what he had done, and he turned the blade on himself, stabbing himself twice. Other neighbours, on hearing the terrible noises, arrived now and held John Fitz, dragging him back up to the bedroom and dragging him back to the bed. A surgeon was sent for who brought leeches and bandages, and he worked on John Fitz, trying desperately to save the reprobate's life, to get him to court in London. But Fitz tore at the leeches and the bandages, and John Fitz bled to death in the bed of the man he had just murdered. It was as his own father had foretold just before his birth. He had died a violent death, his age only 30 years old. And so now to our linked tale of the daughter of Mad John Fitz, and a very strange one it is as well, because Lady Howard, as she was known, is one of the most famous ghosts of the moor. Mary was one of a number of children, and was only 9 years old when her father killed himself at the Anchor Inn. At this young age she became inheritor of all her father's vast estate, and her childhood home of Fitzford House near Tavistock that we can still see the gatehouse of to this very day. Of course, as Mary Fitz became a young lady, many ambitious and greedy eyes turned in the direction of Devon, and in an act common at this time, the early 1600s, the King, now James I, took her from her home, sold her to the Duke of Northumberland, and in turn he married her off to his own brother, Sir Alan Percy. In this way the Crown and the lords of the land controlled the country, its wealth and its power, and women were mere commodities used to keep the wealth in the hands of those highest up in society and the royal family. And so Mary, sold to a stranger, left her home and familiar county of Devon and travelled to her new home, married and became a wife. All of her money and lands were sent directly to her new husband, Percy. Percy, though, well, he didn't last too long. For all of this newly acquired wealth, he died not long afterwards when on a hunting spree. He caught a terrible fever, and he passed away. Now, I can't imagine what Mary must have been thinking through all this change, still a young woman, and all the upheaval and upset. But it seems she began to start to think and plan for herself. The young widow met another man, and this was one who stole her heart, Thomas Darcy. The young lovers planned secretly. One can only imagine the thrill of plotting and daydreaming of a future together, and then the time to put their plans into action. They eloped one night and married in secret. When this act was discovered, the Percy family were absolutely livid. They had lost all the money and Fitzford estate. Tragically, this second marriage was cut short also. After only a few months of wedded bliss, Thomas too died, and once again Mary was left a wealthy widow, and once again Mary was the subject of many greedy suitors. Once again Mary married. This time, however, Mary had grown a lot wiser, and she had found a way to make sure her wealth always remained hers, no matter who she married. As you can imagine, though, once this third husband discovered this, he could not get Mary's money. He was none too pleased, and argument followed argument about her money. It should be his. Why had he married her if not for this? This marriage also did not last long, though, and the reason for this man's death remains unknown. It was after this widowing of Mary that people started to gossip. Was it actually a tragedy or something more sinister? Undeterred and a woman of her own making by now, living her life on her own terms, Mary married again, and with this fourth husband she had a child, a boy who they named George. However, this latest husband also passed away, and she decided to return to Fitzford House with her son and retreat to the quiet of the Devon countryside. And now tragedy happened again. Her young son George passed away. Mary was alone, back at her childhood home and the place where her father held such wicked renown still. Not long after the death of her son, and it was said in utter grief, Mary too passed away, and it was now that the stories of wicked Lady Mary Howard began in earnest. Her father had been a madman, and she had the dubious reputation of outliving 4 husbands and a child. The legend is that Lady Howard was given a punishment for eternity for her wicked ways. Her spirit must travel each night from Fitzford House to Okehampton Castle. Alongside her, a huge black dog with blood-red eyes and massive snarling sharp teeth, and to travel there she was seen in a carriage created from the bare bones of 4 deceased husbands. The driver of the carriage was headless. Once at Okehampton Castle, the huge black dog would run to the castle mound and pluck a single blade of grass, returning to the bone carriage and Mary Howard, whereupon the whole entourage would return to Fitzford House. Here Lady Mary would alight from the carriage with the blade of grass in hand and place it on a particular granite slab. Her punishment would only be finished once every blade of grass was removed from Okehampton Castle. Should the carriage stop for a moment outside any home along the way, a death was sure to occur soon within that family. Witnesses said that as the carriage approached, they could hear the sound of hooves thundering along the road. A chill and then a freezing air surrounded all, and then the rattling of the bones and the stench of the rotting flesh. So, is any of this true? Well, yes and no. Certainly the tale of John Fitz is. Mary, though, local gossip that became folklore and legend, not so much. Mary married Sir John Howard in 1612 and he passed away in 1622, so they actually had 10 years of marriage, not, as the legend says, an unhappy union. On his death, she married again in 1628 to Sir Richard Grenville, who was appalling to Mary, and he did not die in strange circumstances. They actually divorced in 1633, which was not an easy thing to do at this time in England, so the evidence of him and his maltreatment must have been very strong. After the divorce, Mary reverted to her previous married name of Howard. Legend and history was not kind to Lady Mary, but without much evidence. In truth, she was known locally as a decent woman and was well respected in the neighbourhood, despite her father's horrendous reputation, and she had several children. She passed away at the astounding age for that time of 75 years old. And there is a popular ballad written of Lady Howard that says, "My lady hath a sable coach with horses 2 and 4. My lady hath a gauntlet hound that goeth before. My lady's coach hath nodding plumes, the driver hath no head. My lady is an ashen white, as one who is long dead." And I think because of this popular song and everyone loving a ghost story, especially on cold, dark winter nights when we're all huddled together, that the legend of Mary Howard grew and developed. Although Fitzford House only has the gatehouse remaining now, and I believe this is a private home, visitors can still wander around Okehampton Castle and even follow the path of Lady Howard's Walk. It is a really lovely area of Okehampton town and well worth a visit. It is a long time ago when, at a farm on the edge of the moor, a farmer was hard at work in his fields. On the farm were a handful of workers, and one of these fellows came running to him from the farm buildings. The man, breathless and panting, told him that as he had been passing the largest barn, he could hear the sound of a flail being used, but nobody should be there. He knew where every single farm worker was at that time, and so it had to be Dartmoor Pixies, who had decided to help the farm. The farmer stopped what he was doing and placed a hand on the man's shoulder. He must calm down. It would be fine. But the man must not go anywhere near the barn, and to make sure he didn't, the farmer sent the still shaking man to one of the far-off fields to work. Once work was done that day, the farmer and the man crept back to the barn, and now all was silent. They very carefully opened the door a little and peeped inside, and an incredible sight met their eyes. A beautifully presented pile of threshed corn and a perfect stack of golden straw. Both men turned to each other in amazement, and now the farmer gave an order. The labourer must run to the farm kitchen, gather together a plate with some fresh bread, a little cheese, and bring a pail of fresh milk. Once the man returned, intrigued, the farmer placed the food and drink quietly inside the barn and very gently closed the door. Next morning, the farmer called all from the farm to hear what he had to say. The Pixies had come to help them and prepare the harvest of all the crops. Not one single person must go near that barn or they would be taken away by the Pixies. Next, he instructed his farm manager to make sure that every morning the empty plates and the pail were removed quietly from the barn and replaced with full ones without speaking a word. The door must be closed firmly, and then he must leave immediately. After this speech, the farmer and the workers went to the moor to cut bracken, and at the end of the day they returned home to the farmyard. On his own, the farmer crept to the barn and placed his ear to the door to check that all was quiet inside, and opened the door just ever so slightly. Respectfully, he peered into the darkness, and there once more was the empty dishes, and just beyond a pile of corn and another stack of straw. For days and days after this, the Pixies were left to their own devices, and before long all of the corn was threshed and all of the straw had been sorted and stacked, and it was a job perfectly done. The Pixies had been a wonderful help that year. The evening after the last of the crops had been processed, the farmer went to bring in the pail and the plate. They would not be needed anymore. And yet imagine his surprise when he found another pile of grain from who knows what corn, and yet another stack of straw. This was a complete mystery, albeit one that made him smile. And so he went to gather a little more milk and a little more bread and a little more cheese. After not so long, his grain store and the barn were full to the brim. He decided he must build another storage barn to keep the pisky corn and straw safely fresh. And now this second building quickly began to fill. To be honest, the Pixies were providing straw and corn faster than he could actually sell it. This farm became the talk of the moor and beyond. The quality of the produce was absolutely second to none as well. How the heck was this possible? Dartmoor soil is pretty bad. Anyway, the farmer and his workers just kept their secret safely to themselves. After all, they were all doing rather well indeed. Everybody was becoming quite prosperous and didn't want to risk losing this magical help. However, a nasty rumour spread across the moor, as rumours often do. The farmer must have made a deal with the devil and sold his soul. But that same farmer always made his way to the local church every Sunday, and with him all his family and all his workers. And if he was ever asked about the moorland mystery, all he would ever say is, "A little gratitude goes a long way indeed." The main town of Dartmoor is actually Okehampton, a larger town with a mixture of the old and the new, with a larger population and also a military base on the moor. There is a castle, there are beautiful churches and little individual family shops, a railway from the city of Exeter, which now means that moorland visits are even more accessible, and all the amenities a family needs. And this has always been an important place for Dartmoor for hundreds of years. It is an ancient town standing firmly on the edge of the moor. Once, long ago, there was a man who lived in Okehampton named Benjamin Geyer, a wealthy merchant of the town. Now, back in those days, the seafaring merchants faced not only the perils of the waves and the winds, but also attacks and kidnappings and robberies by pirates. And many of these were Arabic. One legend tells of a whole village of people taken never to be seen again. And it is a strange thing that this part of the English coast was frequented by what were known as Barbary pirates. And for a long time this was mere folklore, dismissed by academia, until a team of local hobbyist divers found the remains of a sunken ship off the South Devon coast. On further investigation by experts, it was confirmed that yes, indeed the mythology and the folklore was reality. Arabic pirates did indeed come to England's shores. This shipwreck was the exact measurement of a Barbary ship. And to be fair, with balance, the British pirates were no better at all, and equally as cruel. Anyway, back to the story. Of course, Okehampton merchants needed these shipped goods for their shops and their stores, and all of the people of Devon, like those in its fellow county of Cornwall, understand and respect the seafaring folk. Even landlocked Dartmoor, the concern for the sailing folk was always in the back of their minds, and so a tithe was collected from all the merchants to provide for ransoms of the seafaring men who may have been captured by pirates and ensure their safe return. The Dartmoor merchants all had money invested in these cargo ships. Lose them, even one, and it could be disastrous. In Okehampton, it was Benjamin Geyer who had the job of collecting the money from the townsfolk. Now, it so happened that a number of sailors had been captured, and their ships too, and were being held hostage by pirates, and yet, under agreement, the people would be allowed to pay the ransom and free the men. Many of the ships were Benjamin's own, and a larger sum of money had been collected for the safer return of all the men from so many boats. What the townsfolk did not know was his personal plan. He would use the ransom money for his ships and men to ensure his own investments were safe. Never mind that all the other sailors may end up being near slaves on the pirate ships. He would protect his own interest. Once this plan was put into action, Benjamin Geyer began to fall ill, and over time he grew sicker, and guilt racking at him and eating him away. Sicker and sicker he grew, and before long Benjamin Geyer passed away. But this was not the end of Benjamin Geyer, because his spirit returned to haunt his former home and all the area around, and this ghost began to be quite a nuisance. At last the people of Okehampton could stand this ghost no longer. They called upon the Archdeacon to come and help them lay the ghost to rest. On hearing their story, the Archdeacon gathered together more help from other clergymen nearby, 23 good men in total, to come and help him. And these men worked together to rid the town of Benjamin Geyer, each one in turn commanding the ghost to leave and to pass on. Finally, the commands were repeated in different languages because he wasn't leaving, and it was only when they were spoken of by one clergyman in Arabic that there was an effect. I presume this may be because of the fraud upon the community had come about because of the Barbary pirate problem with his ships that set off the whole affair in the beginning. Now the spirit of Benjamin Geyer replied that now the words had been spoken, he must be gone. But even now, it was still not easy. His spirit transformed into the shape of a colt, and a new bridle never before worn had to be brought to place over its head. The best horseman in Okehampton was brought to the scene, and he was given a blessing by all the people there. He was then commanded to ride the ghost horse to Cranmere Pool on Dartmoor, at one of the highest and most desolate parts of the moor, and never let the spirit's head look one way or the other, but to keep straight forwards and as fast could be. As he neared Cranmere, the rider slipped from the ghost horse's back, and the ghost galloped into the centre of the pool, never to be seen again. Finally, Benjamin Geyer was laid to rest. There is a very interesting side note to this story, because Benjamin Geyer did actually exist. He was a mayor of Okehampton in the years 1673, 1678, 1684 and 1694, passing away on the 21st of May in 1701. In the town records there is a document stating 1670, November, collected by Mr. John Hussey and co-signed Benjamin Geyer, for and towards the relief of poor Protestants taken in Turkey, the charity of the inhabitants of this town and parish, and there was gathered £10 and odd money. So if not all of the tale is true, at least some of it is. Once a little old lady lived in a village on the edge of Dartmoor. She was a widow of many years, living alone in her pretty thatched cottage, and she was known far and wide as a kindly soul, especially to the children who would visit her, or that she would come across on her wanderings. Her friends and neighbours, and even the children, would bring her gifts of eggs and butter and milk and preserves, and as a thank you she would give them beautiful bouquets of flowers to take home, picked fresh from her garden. And her garden was her precious love. Every spare moment she would be out there in all the weathers, working and caring for the plants and the flowers. Animals, insects and birds too flocked to her garden paradise, and she always made sure that there was food enough and water enough for these friendly creatures, especially in the cold wind and snow of a Dartmoor winter. It was on a beautiful summer night when the old lady awoke from her sleep, and she was sure she could hear gentle music drifting to her in the darkness. Listening more carefully, she could trace the sound to her very own garden and the spot below her very own bedroom window. She slipped from her bed, and as quietly as possible she tiptoed to the window. She could not believe her eyes, and she could not believe what she was seeing. Pixies. The little figures were dancing around in the garden, and the music that she could hear was being played by a pixie band who were playing with great gusto and prowess. She could not believe that these little ethereal creatures were comfortable in her own garden, and she was delighted watching the whole scene silently and utterly entranced. The tempo of the music now started to increase, and now she could see the beautiful tulips that she had been growing were starting to sway to the music, along with the little pixies. As the bright beams of moonlight shone, she could just make out that each tulip flower had a tiny baby that was sleeping soundly inside. The old lady watched all night long, and as the first rays of sun began to creep over her garden, she saw that all the little fairy creatures gathered the babies together and ran into the undergrowth. From that very moment, the old lady made a promise to them and herself that she would always grow tulips, and their babies would always have flower beds to rest in. And this beautiful pact carried on for many, many years. But, of course, time comes to take us all, and one day the much-loved little old lady was no more in the village on the edge of the Dartmoor. Instead, she was lain to rest in the pretty churchyard, and yet somehow always a bunch of beautiful tulips were placed upon her grave. Eventually, a new owner bought the cottage, and this was an older man with ideas of his own, and certainly no idea of how to respect the Pixies. His plan was the flower garden would go, turned over to vegetables, not frivolous blooms and blossoms. And so he turned the soil and threw away all the bulbs and pulled up all the roots, and finally everything was gone, and it was a clean slate for his own plan to be put into action. Along with the flowers, the animals and the insects and the birds were no longer welcome, and they no longer came to the garden. The old man would not allow anything to damage his vegetables or his salads, and he did not believe one bit in anything so ridiculous as Dartmoor Pixies, and scoffed as the villagers told him of the history of the cottage, and the old lady, and her friendship with Pixies. The so-called ridiculous Pixies, who did exist of course, were not happy at all about the changes at the cottage garden, or the lack of respect, and Pixies have great power over nature, but a silly old man who doesn't even believe in them would have no idea about this. Shaking their little heads, the Pixies brought together their energy. From now on, not one thing would grow successfully in that little garden. And so it was. No matter how much the man threw down fertiliser or turned the soil or brought fresh seeds, nothing prospered. Nothing would grow except a sense of disappointment. Over time, everything withered away, and even the soil became bad and cracked and strangely dry. And it is said that that cottage to this very day has a problem garden. Maybe nobody has thought to simply plant a few tulip bulbs. Finally, we come to one story that, to be perfectly honest, I have avoided because so many people have covered this story, and yet so many people equally have asked me to narrate this tale in my own way. And so I have relented. It is based in an area of Dartmoor that my husband and I know very well. We've driven this road countless times and never had our own experience, but it is a strange area though. A small bridge with a weird camber to the road, unexpectedly steep, and the land around it is bleak fields and pine forest. Very beautiful in its own way, but just that little bit eerie. Something that had been noted many times by walkers here is a growing sense of panic that overcomes them and a dark, threatening energy. This road is the B3212 between Post Bridge and Two Bridges, one of the main roads of the moor. It was once a turnpike road, Carter's Road, so it was called, because it was built by a fellow named Carter. There have been many strange occurrences on this small stretch of road, spectral hands taking over the wheel of the handlebars or the car, losing traction on the road's surface, and a stomach-churning fear gripping the driver, and those hands, strong, gripping your own, and covered with an unnatural hairiness, human, but not quite. The stories seem to have started around the early 1900s, with unexplained accidents always in the same place. People happily enjoying cycle rides or holidays in this popular moorland told of heavy hands grabbing the handlebars and roughly forcing them off the road, and of being flung onto the verges and into the hollows. Those travelling by horse and cart or pony trap began to report similar events, the reins being grabbed, horses shying and whinnying, and an unnatural atmosphere, the carts and the traps almost falling into the ditches that line the road. And as time went along, car drivers and motorbike riders also had terrifying experiences. Travelling at a higher speed now than a cart or a cycle, to fall at this point could be deadly, and it was. Sweat dripping icily down the back of the neck as the hands grabbed the steering wheel and jerking the vehicle left and right, fighting for but losing control, fighting again to regain control. This was a story that was growing and growing. In the 1920s, in 1921, a tragic accident happened. This time, a motorbike and sidecar had flown off the road. Driving the bike was Dr. Holby of Princetown. The sidecar had two girls. Some reports say that these were his own daughters. Others record that these were the daughters of the Deputy Governor of Dartmoor Prison at Princetown. As the vehicle had left the road, the two girls had been thrown from the sidecar and so saved, despite receiving horrific injuries. The doctor, though, he didn't make it. His skull was fractured. The coroner recorded that the wheel spokes of the bike and the axle had broken up. Nearby this road is a place called Powder Mills. You can actually see it slightly off in the distance to one side as you drive along the Hairy Hands Road, an old collection of buildings, once a gunpowder mill. Now I believe you can visit the cottages there and get one of the best cream teas on Dartmoor. But in the 1920s this was a more desolate place, and a woman and her husband had parked up to sleep in their caravan here when it was a little more secluded and away from the road. On one of the moonlight Dartmoor nights she awoke feeling that something was just not right, that somebody was outside the caravan, and it was then that she saw a large hand clawing up and down the window near where her husband lay. The hand was covered in hair, and she could feel an evil energy trying to attack her husband. She fell to her knees and made the sign of the cross and said a prayer to herself, and the hand disappeared. Later it was found that a car had come off the nearby road and the driver had passed away. An army officer lived through an attack not long after the tragedy of the doctor's death. He was also travelling by motorbike and happily lived to tell the tale. And what a tale! He spoke of very muscular hairy hands clutching onto his own as they held the handlebars, and the hands forcing his bike off the road and onto the moorland, It was terrifying. The national newspaper, the Daily Mail, heard of this account and it became a hugely popular story of the time. The more local paper, the Western Morning News, ran a correspondence from the Dartmoor writer Beatrice Chase on the 24th of October 1921. In this she gave her own idea of what could be happening. She suggested that maybe the magnetic effect of the granite rocks here, under certain condition, could maybe cause the metal of the vehicles to be attracted to the rocks. She also asked if people from the authorities could maybe test this theory and solve the increasingly worrying problem. The local council did go to the moor, to this site, not to test her theory though, but to make alterations and repairs to the road. In the same year, a charabanc, which is a vehicle looking a little like an extended car mixed with a small bus, was travelling along the road carrying many passengers. This vehicle also came to this disturbing section of road. It unexpectedly swerved to one side, sped right across the opposite side of the road, thankfully with no oncoming traffic, and drove up a grass bank. As seatbelts were not worn in those days and charabancs were open to the elements, many passengers were thrown from the charabanc. All were injured, one quite seriously so. On being questioned, the driver told of strong hairy hands that seemed to grab his, and he fought against these, and this had ended up with the accident. In autumn of 1947 there was a further tragedy. This time an Exeter couple who had been visiting Princetown, where the young man had downed 2 or 3 pints of beer at one of the local pubs. He had been driving the bike and she was in the sidecar, and she made a point of telling him to drive very slowly as he had had a drink or two. As they came nearer to Cherrybrook Bridge, for some reason the bike began to speed up and lose control. The bike hit the wall of the bridge. Although an ambulance arrived as quickly as possible and the driver was taken to hospital at Tavistock, sadly he didn't make it. He fractured his skull. As they had lost control, the sidecar had become unattached from the bike and the girl had been thrown from the sidecar, but at least she had survived. Of course, there was an inquest, and at this the local police constable, P.C. Tancock from Princetown, told the coroner that both the young people had been noted as very sober as they made their way out of the pub at Princetown. In his estimation, the bike must have wobbled as it came to this area of the bridge, and the young rider could not pull back control. It was regarded as an accidental death, and shows how treacherous this stretch of road is. The next recorded sighting was 1962, when on holiday on Dartmoor, Florence Warwick was quite happily driving along the road when she decided she needed to check her map. She pulled the car over safely, ready to check location, and in Florence's own words, "I looked up and I saw a pair of huge hairy hands pressed against the windscreen. I tried to scream, but I couldn't. I was frozen with fear." Moving into the 2000s, we get to 2008, and even then we have a driver who told the tale that while driving, he felt and he saw huge hairy hands grab his own hands and the steering wheel and try to drive him off the road. And to this very day there are reports of an uneasy feeling while driving this Dartmoor stretch of road, or seeing things from the corner of one's eye. It's a mystery. So do we have any idea why hairy hands would haunt this part of Dartmoor? Well, not completely, but there are ideas. There is a tale, a suggestion, that there was once a worker at the nearby gunpowder mills, what was Powder Mill's factory in its day, who was known for having rather large and hairy hands. The man found out he had been left some money from a distant relative overseas, in Italy. This meant that he could retire, and a celebration was planned for his last day. At the end of the shift, the revels began, and at the end of these revels he decided he would probably like to keep some of his old tools as a memento, as so much of his life had focused around these and the old powder mills. The man went to the workshop to collect them. Now, because of the nature of gunpowder and its obvious volatility, Nobody was allowed to wear hobnail boots anywhere near the powder was being made or stored. The floors were Dartmoor granite. Just one spark from a nail of a boot could set the whole thing off. In his bliss, and probably his cups, he'd completely forgotten this and strove to retrieve his tools. And you can only imagine the result. The poor man never survived. He never got to enjoy his retirement or a happy ever after. He was so badly damaged by the explosion that all was identifiable by friends was his hands, his large hairy hands. Powder mills were dreadfully dangerous and unhealthy places. Even in this one mill on Dartmoor there were many explosions. In 1851 an explosion and a fire took the life from one man of burns, and 3 others were seriously injured. The man who sadly passed away had a wife and 5 children, and only the day after, in another section of the same powder mill, there was an explosion so forceful that it completely destroyed that part of the building. Another explosion occurred in 1857, and this too took a life. Roger Northcott. May they all rest in peace, these tragic souls. And so could one of these men be the answer to the Hairy Hands mystery? Why would his spirit want to cause more tragedy? Or is the spirit acting in panic, desperately reaching out to whoever is there or passing, in a final ghostly attempt to be saved? We can never know. But if you ever visit Dartmoor and are driving the road between 2 bridges and Post Bridge, please do make sure you check your speed as you go down towards Cherrybrook Bridge. It's a tricky road at the best of times, even without the problem of hairy hands. So, dear pals, another Dartmoor episode comes to a close. This year I was absolutely delighted to be asked by Dartmoor Museum in Okehampton to be part of their fabulous exhibition of folklore of Dartmoor. Some of my episodes ran on the TV there for people who wanted to stop and rest a while and listen to the tales of the moor. It was a real privilege, and I am ever grateful for this. And although I didn't get to visit myself because we live so far away now, I was definitely there in voice and spirit. Thank you once again, friends, for all your support and kind words. I know the episodes have been rather sporadic, life and animals and health gets in the way, and I get very disappointed that I can't produce more, but trust me, I have plans for the future which mean I should get more tales of fae and folk online more regularly. So, until next time, my dear friends, take care, brightest of blessings, and remember, don't play with the fairy folk, and definitely not the Dartmoor Pixies, or you may end up in one of my folk tales yourself.